The Galactic Council chamber loomed like a cathedral carved from the heart of a dying star. Its blackened walls shimmered faintly, as if infused with trapped constellations. The air was dense with the mingling scents of alien perfumes, metallic tangs, and faintly bitter spores, each representing a species' pride in its presence. A low thrum vibrated through the polished obsidian floors, a quiet reminder of the station's incomprehensible scale. Delegates filed into their elevated tiers, each seat a testament to the species it represented. The Zeon envoy, crystalline and angular, refracted light into dancing rainbows with every movement. Beside them, the Jalikar's robed figure oozed a bioluminescent trail, a living tapestry of shifting hues. The Velthan ambassador adjusted their whisper-thin exosuit, their fragile, almost glass-like body gleaming under the chamber's pale lighting. All attention, however, was fixed on the central dais, where a single, empty platform awaited. "Do they not understand protocol?" rumbled the Varan delegate, an insectoid titan whose chitinous armor glinted under the council's starlit dome. Their mandibles clicked in frustration, echoing their rising irritation. Arriving late to the most significant assembly in decades? Typical of primitives. Perhaps, mused the Zeon ambassador, their crystalline body pulsing faintly, their concept of time lacks sophistication. Or perhaps they seek to make an entrance. Before anyone could retort, the chamber's light dimmed to an expectant hush. A ripple of sound, not from engines but from magnetic locks disengaging, reverberated as a vessel anchored to the docking spire above. All eyes turned upward, following a translucent panel that displayed the descending craft. It was angular, unpolished, and brutally utilitarian. Unlike the soaring elegance of Silthar energy weave ships or the organic pulsating curves of Keva bioships, this was a slab of metal given purpose. No one dared call it beautiful, but there was a cold resolve in its design, a predator's efficiency over an artisan's flourish. "They didn't even polish it," someone muttered. The vessel landed with a mechanical finality. The docking bridge extended like a steel tongue, and footsteps echoed, sharp, deliberate. From the shadows of the airlock emerged three figures clad in matte black uniforms. The humans. Commander Elias Darrow walked at their center, his silhouette broad and upright, every step a calculated statement. His dark eyes scanned the chamber, missing nothing, acknowledging no one. The light caught the sharp lines of his face, but there was no arrogance in his features, only the restrained intensity of a hunter watching prey. The delegate beside him, a woman with cropped hair and an unassuming posture, carried a small case. Her movements were precise, her gaze alert, suggesting a readiness not seen in other diplomats. Behind her, an aide, young, wiry, and watchful, wore the kind of stillness born from years of observing chaos. Darrow stepped onto the dais, his boots striking the polished surface with an unhurried rhythm. The silence thickened, interrupted only by the ambient sounds of delegates adjusting themselves or whispered translations among species. Every being in the chamber leaned forward, craning to decipher the intentions behind the humans' inscrutable expressions. From the elevated tiers, the Thalys delegate, whose translucent energy shields flickered orange in agitation, leaned toward a nearby representative. "They seem underwhelming, don't they?" "They don't belong here," hissed the Varan, voice low but sharp. "Soft skins with no shields, no elegance, a relic species from a violent planet." "I wouldn't discount them yet," the Zeon murmured, their crystalline form glinting ominously. On the dais, Darrow raised his head slightly, his gaze meeting the assembled council without hesitation. The lights caught faint scars running across his knuckles, small, almost invisible, but the kind that spoke of survival, not vanity. "We are here," Darrow began, his voice cutting through the air like a blade measured and without adornment, "to observe." The chamber reacted as if an invisible wire had snapped. The Velthan delegates shifted uneasily in their seat, their fragile limbs twitching. The Jalikar's bioluminescence dimmed, reflecting discomfort. Even the Varan hesitated before barking, "To observe? Is that a joke?" Darrow's eyes moved slowly, fixing on the insectoid delegate with a gaze so steady it stilled the air around him. "It's not." There was no defensiveness in his tone, no need to fill the silence with justification. Instead, his words hung in the air like a challenge. Around him, the humans stood as immovable as statues, their silence more profound than speeches. The Zeon ambassador's crystalline form refracted light into faint prisms of amusement. "Observe what, Commander Darrow? Our council chambers? Our debates? Or is this simply an excuse to gawk at more advanced civilizations?" Darrow didn't blink. "We're here to understand." A murmur rippled through the delegates, some voices low with suspicion, others tinged with derision. "To understand what?" The Thallus delegate pressed, their energy shields flaring briefly, casting flickers of orange across the room. "Everything," Darrow replied, his tone even, unshaken. "The Council, its function, its failures." The final word struck like an unspoken insult. The Velthan ambassador, normally hesitant to speak, broke the silence with a chime-like voice. "Failures? We are the architects of galactic peace." "Peace?" Darrow's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Or stagnation?" The chamber erupted. The Varan delegate slammed a clawed fist onto their tier's railing. "You dare question the Council's authority?" Darrow remained unmoved. "No," he replied calmly. "I'm questioning its effectiveness." The silence that followed was heavy, like the moment before a storm. For a heartbeat no one spoke, no one moved. Even the chamber's usual ambient noises seemed to dull, as if the room itself waited. The Zeon ambassador finally broke the tension, their voice tinged with cautious curiosity. "You came all this way for that? To sit in silence and pass judgment?" Darrow tilted his head slightly. "No judgment, just observation, for now." The pause after those last two words seemed to last a lifetime. Subtle as they were, they carried an undercurrent of something darker, a promise or a warning, impossible to tell. Without waiting for further response, Darrow inclined his head, a gesture that felt more like dismissal than respect, and turned to leave the dais. His delegation followed, their steps echoing through the charged silence of the chamber. The Velthan delegate turned to their neighbor, their glassy body trembling faintly. "They've said almost nothing. And yet," the Zeon whispered, their crystalline body dimming slightly, "they've said everything." Above the chamber, the translucent panel displayed the human's craft slowly departing from the docking spire. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't remarkable, but as the ship disappeared into the void, its shadow seemed to linger far longer than it should have. The council chamber remained silent, delegates exchanging uneasy glances. Something unspoken had settled in the air, an understanding that no one dared to voice. Far from unremarkable, the humans had left an impression deeper than words ever could. The council chamber still buzzed with unease long after the humans had departed. Their craft, though gone, had left behind an almost imperceptible tension, a thin, invisible thread pulling at the edges of the gathered delegates' composure. Whispers filled the air, sharp and fragmented, like leaves rustling before a storm. The Zeon ambassador's crystalline limbs emitted soft, clicking sounds as they shifted in their seat, a rare display of unease. "They say little and reveal less," they murmured, their voice pitched low for the Varan delegate beside them. "A dangerous combination." "Words are cheap," the Varan delegate growled, his mandibles clicking with irritation. Action is what reveals intent, and they've done nothing." The Zeon refracted a prism of faint light toward the dais, where the humans had stood moments before. "Perhaps that's what unsettles me. They did nothing. Yet everything has changed." Commander Elias Darrow and his delegation moved through the station's labyrinthine corridors, their footsteps muted by the woven floors. The station's air was dry and faintly metallic, carrying the tang of processed oxygen. Every surface gleamed, polished to the kind of perfection that felt sterile, devoid of life. Darrow glanced briefly at the sleek walls, their mirrored finish reflecting the distant shimmer of starlight filtering through translucent panels. His expression remained as unreadable as ever. Behind him, Lieutenant Nadia Vale adjusted her grip on the small case she carried, her movements as precise as a metronome. "They're rattled," she remarked quietly. "You could feel it in the air." "Good," Darrow replied without turning. His voice carried a weight that silenced further commentary. There was no satisfaction in his tone, only cold pragmatism. He paused briefly as they reached an overlook, a vast window that framed the endless sprawl of space. The station's silhouette loomed large against a field of distant stars. Below, clusters of smaller ships moved like fireflies, their lights flickering in erratic patterns. Darrow's gaze remained fixed on the void. "What's the Council's next move?" Nadia tilted her head slightly, considering. "A test. They'll provoke us, invite us into one of their endless debates. They want to see if we'll bend." "We won't," Darrow replied simply, turning away from the window. His expression hardened. "But we'll make them think we might." The Velthan ambassador's voice echoed faintly across the chamber as the next item on the Council's agenda was announced, a border dispute between the Alaran and the Zerval colonies over a mineral-rich moon. Such disputes were as old as the Council itself, a recurring farce performed with elaborate ceremony. The Alaran delegate, whose translucent, jelly-like form pulsed faintly in agitation, stepped forward to present their case. Darrow's delegation returned to the chamber with the same deliberate pace they had left, drawing immediate attention. They moved to their assigned seats without a word, their silence rippling through the assembly. The Velthan ambassador's voice faltered mid-sentence, the weight of their arrival stealing the room's focus. The Alaran, flustered but determined, resumed their argument. "This moon is critical to our people's survival. Without its resources, our energy infrastructure will collapse." The Zerval delegate, an imposing reptilian figure draped in ceremonial silks, hissed in reply. "You squander what you take. We have equal claim, if not more." As their voices climbed, filling the chamber with the sharp bite of accusation and rebuttal, Darrow leaned back in his seat, studying the scene with detached interest. His eyes flicked between the speakers, noting every gesture, every inflection. It didn't take long for the Council to extend an invitation to humanity. The Silthar mediator, a being of glowing threads woven into a humanoid form, turned toward Darrow with an almost imperceptible shift in their luminescence. "Commander Darrow, as observers, you are welcome to provide input. We value new perspectives." Darrow didn't immediately respond. The pause was calculated, enough to let the weight of the invitation settle in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm, cutting through the noise like a scalpel. "We decline." The silence that followed was sharp, uncomfortable. Delegates exchanged uneasy glances, their disbelief palpable. The Silthar's glow shifted subtly, a faint crimson hue bleeding into their otherwise calm exterior. "Decline? The Council offered this opportunity in good faith. We don't mediate disputes that don't involve us," Darrow said evenly. "If the Alaran and Zerval cannot resolve this themselves, they'll have to find another way." The Varan delegate surged to his feet, his mandibles clattering loudly. "You think you're above this? Above us?" Darrow's gaze flicked toward the Varan, unflinching. "I think that endless debates over scraps of rock don't serve anyone." The Zerval delegate's reptilian eyes narrowed, their scaled brow furrowing. "And what would you suggest? War?" Darrow's answer came without hesitation. "If they can't find peace, then yes. Sometimes war is more honest than diplomacy that solves nothing." The chamber erupted into chaos. Voices clashed, overlapping in a cacophony of outrage and disbelief. Some called the humans barbaric. Others muttered grudging admiration for their bluntness. The Silthar mediator's glow deepened to a searing red as they raised a hand, calling for order. "Commander Darrow," the Silthar said, their tone sharp and cutting. "Your approach is reckless. The Council exists to prevent conflict, to maintain balance." "And how's that working out for you?" Darrow replied, his tone devoid of mockery but laced with an undeniable edge. "How many disputes have you mediated that ended in lasting peace? How many species have been left to rot while you argued over logistics?" The weight of his words settled heavily over the room. For a moment no one spoke. Even the Varan delegate, seething as he was, seemed unable to form a retort. Nadia leaned slightly toward Darrow, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You're making enemies faster than alliances." "Let them stew," Darrow murmured. "They're more predictable that way." As the council session adjourned, the delegates filed out in tense silence, their whispers trailing like smoke in their wake. In the shadows of the chamber, the Zean ambassador lingered, their crystalline body catching the faintest slivers of light. "To watch is one thing," they said softly, their voice directed at no one in particular. "To refuse is another. But to speak so plainly, that is the most dangerous of all." Commander Darrow walked past without acknowledgement, his figure vanishing into the corridors beyond. Behind him, the echoes of his steps seemed to linger longer than they should, leaving the council with more questions than answers. The stars outside the Galactic Council station gleamed with cold indifference, their distant light a stark contrast to the heated whispers that filled the station's halls. Every delegate carried the weight of the humans' refusal, their defiance a silent drumbeat of unease. In private corners, alliances were tested, doubts seeded. For Commander Elias Darrow and his delegation, however, the station's oppressive formality felt like a performance they were content to watch unravel. They walked with unhurried precision through the corridors, their black uniforms as stark as the void beyond. Their silence was not the absence of noise. It was a presence, a void of its own that demanded attention without effort. A soft chime interrupted the corridor's stillness as Darrow approached a communications terminal. The message that flickered to life was short and grim. A species on the Council's outermost borders, the Velthan, had sent an urgent distress signal. A fleet from the Zelvar Dominion, a warlike empire that thrived on conquest, was advancing, raising outposts as they pushed deeper into Velthan territory. The Council's official response was sluggish, lost in the mire of debate and protocol. Nadia Vale scanned the report, her jaw tightening. "The Velthan don't stand a chance. Their defenses are ornamental at best." Darrow didn't reply immediately, his gaze fixed on the terminal as if searching for a hidden answer in the cold glow of the text. The air between them seemed to grow heavier, the faint metallic tang of the station's recycled atmosphere sharp in the back of their throats. "They'll call for a peacekeeping vote," Darrow said at last, his voice low, measured. "By the time they agree on deployment, there won't be a Velthan colony left." "So what do we do?" Vale's question was pointed, but her tone carried no urgency. She already knew the answer. "We act," Darrow said simply. Hours later, the human ship detached from the station with the same quiet resolve that had marked its arrival. Inside the utilitarian craft, the crew moved with practiced efficiency. Lights flickered faintly across the polished surfaces, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to mirror the mood. Weapons were calibrated, systems double-checked. There was no rush, no frantic energy, only the steady rhythm of professionals preparing for the inevitable. Vale stood by a reinforced viewport, her fingers drumming lightly on the edge. The Velthan colonies lay hours away, but already the weight of their desperation pressed against her thoughts. "This isn't protocol," the young aide, Lieutenant Marcus Hale, murmured. He was perched at a control station nearby, his hands resting on the edge of the console. "If the Council finds out, they'll find out," Darrow said from the command platform. His back was to them, his gaze fixed on the holographic map of Velthan space projected before him. "And they'll do what they always do: debate, condemn, avoid responsibility." The room was silent for a moment, save for the quiet beeping of the ship's systems. Finally, Vale turned, her expression hard but resolute. "Let's make sure we give them something worth debating." The Zelvar fleet was a sight to behold. From the edge of Velthan territory, the human sensors picked up the massive warships, a wall of bioceramic hulls bristling with weapons that pulsed faintly, like veins coursing with fire. Their movements were calculated, precise, each ship advancing in perfect formation. "Overkill," Hale muttered, his eyes narrowing at the display. "This isn't a battle. It's an extermination." Darrow's voice cut through the observation like a blade. And they think we'll watch it happen. The human ship moved toward the fleet with deliberate slowness, its unassuming silhouette a stark contrast to the Zelvar war machines. Inside the human vessel, the atmosphere was tense but controlled, every crew member focused on their task. "Send the broadcast," Darrow ordered. Vale nodded, her fingers flying over the console. A moment later, the ship's communications array activated, projecting a message directly to the Zelvar flagship. It was short, almost curt. "Cease your attack. Withdraw from Velthan territory immediately." On the Zelvar bridge, High Warlord Kraskis received the transmission with a wave of his clawed hand. His segmented exoskeleton gleamed under the harsh light, and his multifaceted eyes shimmered with disdain. "Send a response," he commanded, his voice resonating with a guttural growl. The Zelvar communications officer obeyed, broadcasting Kraskis's retort across the sector. "To the insolent softskins who dare to interrupt the Dominion, you are insignificant. We will crush you, as we have crushed countless others." Darrow's lips curved faintly at the edges, though the expression lacked mirth. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," he said quietly. The Zelvar opened fire. The void exploded with color, plasma bolts searing through the darkness, leaving trails of molten energy in their wake. The human ship danced through the barrage, its movements unorthodox, almost chaotic. It didn't dodge in predictable arcs, but pivoted sharply, exploiting every gap in the Zelvar assault with surgical precision. Inside the human vessel, the atmosphere was electric. Sparks flew as a near miss jolted the ship, but the crew's focus remained unbroken. Vale barked orders, her voice slicing through the noise. "Redirect power to aft shields, recalibrate targeting systems, focus on the flagship. Are we seriously engaging them head-on?" Hale's voice carried a note of incredulity, though he obeyed without hesitation. "We're not engaging," Darrow corrected, his tone cold and deliberate. "We're delivering a message." A pulse of light surged from the human ship. One precise, blinding lance of energy. It wasn't a conventional weapon. It was something else entirely. The beam struck the Zelvar flagship, not with explosive force, but with a quiet finality. The ship shuddered violently, its bioceramic hull rippling as though alive. Then, in a silent burst of disintegration, it crumbled into nothingness. The Zelvar fleet hesitated. For the first time, their perfect formation wavered, uncertainty rippling through their ranks like a broken wave. "Send the second message," Darrow ordered. Vale activated the comms again, her voice steady and unyielding. "Withdraw, or this will not end with one ship." In the stunned silence that followed, the Zelvar ships began to retreat. One by one, their engines flared, turning them back toward Dominion space. The battle had ended before it truly began. Inside the human ship, the crew exhaled as one. Relief mingled with the sharp tang of burnt circuits and the faint metallic bite of the air. Hale leaned back in his chair, his face pale but composed. "That's going to be hard to explain." Darrow straightened, his expression unyielding. "We won't need to explain anything. The Council will do it for us." As the ship turned back toward Velthan space, the distant stars seemed colder, sharper, as though watching. Darrow knew the Council would hear of this, knew they would rage, condemn, and plot. But for now, the Velthan would survive, and that was enough. For now. The Velthan colony hung in the shadow of its dying star, its fragile domes shimmering faintly beneath the harsh light. Even from orbit, the scars of the Zelvar assault were visible. Charred craters in the planet's surface, shattered transport lanes, spiraling away like fractured glass. The human vessel approached the colony's perimeter with measured precision, its utilitarian design stark against the chaotic beauty of the surrounding debris field. Inside the ship, the air crackled with subdued tension. Crew members moved with deliberate focus, their voices low, clipped. Commander Elias Darrow stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the colony's holographic projection. The rotating image displayed structural damage, energy readings flickering like fragile pulses. "They've lost power to their southern quadrant," Lieutenant Nadia Vale noted, her tone steady but weighted. "Air filtration's down. They won't last long without intervention." Darrow didn't respond immediately. His gaze swept the room, noting every display, every shifting graph. The silence wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. "Send the message," he said finally. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of command. Vale activated the comms channel, her fingers dancing over the console. "Velthan Command, this is the Terran vessel Pathfinder. We are inbound with emergency supplies and tactical assistance. Request permission to land." Static crackled in reply, the faint echoes of a strained system filtering through. Then a voice, a thin, reedy sound, layered with fatigue, responded. "Permission granted. Landing coordinates transmitted." The ship descended into the atmosphere, its hull rattling faintly under the pressure shift. Outside the viewport, the colony loomed larger, its domes a patchwork of resilience and ruin. Smoke curled from jagged fractures in the outer shields, mingling with the harsh glare of emergency lights. As the ship touched down with a controlled lurch, the crew braced themselves. The landing bay was barely functional, its floor littered with debris. Sparks leapt from exposed wires overhead, the air heavy with the acrid tang of burnt materials and stale oxygen. The distant roar of machinery rumbled through the bay, a sound too guttural to suggest stability. Darrow led the way down the ramp, his boots striking the battered metal with a deliberate cadence. The Velthan greeted them, a skeletal figure encased in a translucent exosuit. Their fragile limbs moved with an unsteady grace, their glass-like body refracting the dim light. "You're late," the Velthan commander said, their voice a chiming melody edged with exhaustion. Their glowing eyes, faintly golden, studied Darrow with a mix of wariness and faint hope. "You're alive," Darrow replied, his tone neutral. "That's what matters." The Velthan commander's shoulders stiffened, but they offered no retort. Instead, they gestured toward a corridor beyond the bay, its walls marred with blackened streaks. "This way. We've stabilized the central sector, but the southern quadrant is fragile." As the humans followed, the devastation became more evident. The walls bore scorch marks that spoke of desperate firefights. The air was thick, tinged with a metallic bite and the faint, cloying scent of decay. Broken equipment lined the corridors, wires spilling from their ruptured casings like spilled entrails. Vale walked beside Darrow, her sharp eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. "This place is barely holding together," she murmured, her voice low. "One more attack, and they're finished." "They won't get one," Darrow replied. The southern quadrant was worse. The air was stifling, the filtration systems groaning under the strain. Survivors huddled in corners, their glassy forms dull and pitted. Some clutched at damaged suits, their hands trembling as they struggled to patch cracks that oozed faint streams of vapor. A Velthan engineer approached, their exosuits streaked with grime. "We've rerouted power to the critical sectors, but we're losing containment on sub-level 3. "Show me," Darrow said. The sub-level was a maze of narrow corridors, the walls trembling faintly with the vibration of overworked machinery. Emergency lights flickered erratically, casting long shadows that twisted with every shift. A faint mist hung in the air, the result of ruptured coolant systems clinging to the walls like ghostly veils. As they reached the containment breach, Darrow knelt beside the exposed energy grid. The heat radiating from the damaged node was palpable, the air around it shimmering faintly. He gestured for Vale, who handed him a toolkit with practiced efficiency. "You know this isn't part of the plan," she said quietly, her voice just above a whisper. Darrow didn't look up. Plans change. The repairs were painstaking, every movement precise. Sweat beaded on Darrow's forehead, the heat from the grid searing against his skin. The Velthan engineer hovered nearby, their glowing eyes wide with apprehension. "If this fails," the engineer began, their voice trembling, "the entire quadrant will—" "It won't fail," Darrow interrupted, his tone final. With a final adjustment, the grid surged to life, the energy field stabilizing in a cascade of light. The mist dissipated as the temperature dropped, the machinery settling into a steady rhythm. The Velthan engineer exhaled a sound that was almost a sigh. "You've bought us time." "That's all we need," Darrow said, rising to his feet. His gaze turned to Vale. "Get the supplies offloaded. We leave in 2 hours. 2 hours later, the ship lifted off, leaving the Velthan colony in its wake. Inside the command room, the crew gathered around the central display. Reports of Zelvar fleet movements flashed across the screens, each marked with a bright, pulsing icon. "They've regrouped," Hale said, his voice tight. "Looks like they're consolidating near the border." Darrow stared at the display, his expression unreadable. "They're testing us." "And the Council?" Vale asked. "They're watching," Darrow said. His tone carried no triumph, no satisfaction, only certainty. The ship's comms chimed, the familiar signature of an encrypted transmission. Vale answered, her brow furrowing as the screen filled with the image of a council representative, the Silthar mediator, their form pulsing faintly with agitated light. "Commander Darrow," the mediator began, their tone clipped. "Your intervention in Velthan space was unauthorized." "So were the Zelvar," Darrow replied, his voice cold and measured, "but I don't see them on this channel." The Silthar's glow deepened. "You have disrupted the balance. Your actions—" "Saved lives," Darrow interrupted. "Your balance didn't." The connection terminated abruptly, the silence that followed thick with unspoken tension. Darrow turned back to the display, his gaze hard. "This isn't over," Vale said, her voice low. "It never is," Darrow replied. His eyes remained fixed on the map, the pulsing icons like embers against the dark void. Whatever came next, the humans would be ready. The council chamber was a riot of agitation. Delegates murmured and gestured in heated discussions, their varied forms reflecting unease. Crystalline figures pulsed with erratic flashes, segmented appendages clicked against rails, and liquid forms shimmered with undulating ripples. The humans' actions in Velthan space had sparked a wildfire of fear and speculation, and the blaze showed no sign of dying down. "They act without authorization," bellowed the Varan delegate, their mandibles snapping in frustration. "Are we to permit this chaos?" The Zean ambassador, their crystalline body refracting light into sharp prisms, spoke with an uncharacteristic edge. "We permit nothing. The humans have demonstrated they need no permission. That is what should concern us." In the far corner, the Silthar mediator sat motionless, their energy field subdued. For the first time in centuries, they had no answers. Every carefully honed method of negotiation had failed to account for a species that operated outside their framework. From their designated tier, the human delegation remained silent. Commander Darrow sat at the center, his posture relaxed but unyielding, his face a mask of composure. Beside him, Lieutenant Vale leaned forward, her sharp gaze sweeping the room. Marcus Hale stood slightly behind them, his expression tight with controlled anticipation. The silence from the humans was deafening, a calculated absence of defense. Darrow let the accusations and speculations roll over them, his stillness forcing the council to fill the void with their own unease. It was only when the Silthar mediator addressed him directly that he stirred. "Commander Darrow," the mediator began, their voice clipped and restrained, "your intervention has disrupted the council's processes. This cannot continue." Darrow's gaze settled on the mediator, unblinking. If the council's processes worked, there would have been no need for intervention. The reply was a knife edge, cutting through the chamber's noise. The mediator's glow flared slightly, but they did not reply. The silence that followed was a hollow chasm, deep and uncomfortable. Before another word could be spoken, the chamber's ambient lighting dimmed, and a holographic display unfurled above the central dais. It was a transmission from the Zelvar Dominion, crude, heavily encrypted, and radiating with malice. The image of High Warlord Kraskus filled the display, his segmented exoskeleton glinting under harsh red lights. His multifaceted eyes seemed to burn, and his voice, guttural and venomous, reverberated through the chamber. "To the so-called Galactic Council and its cowardly members," he sneered, "your inability to act has emboldened these Terrans. Their interference will not be tolerated. Their actions are an affront to our sovereignty. You have failed to control them. We will." The display cut to a view of a fleet, a wall of bioceramic warships bristling with weapons. Their advance was deliberate, methodical, each vessel a jagged predator slicing through the void. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the chamber bathed in an uneasy glow. "They're coming for us," Vale murmured to Darrow, her voice barely above a whisper. "And they're making sure the whole galaxy knows it." Darrow rose slowly, his movements deliberate, the subtle creak of his chair echoing in the silence. He addressed no one directly, yet the weight of his presence commanded attention. "You wanted to know why we act," he said, his voice low and even. "This is why." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out of the chamber, his delegation falling into step behind him. Their departure left a void that the Council struggled to fill, the silence once again their loudest statement. Back aboard the Pathfinder, the air was charged with anticipation. Crew members moved with quiet efficiency, their faces grim but resolute. The tactical display projected a three-dimensional map of the Zelvar fleet's approach, red icons pulsing with hostile intent. "They'll be in Velthan space within 2 cycles, Hale reported, his voice steady but clipped. "They're not holding back this time." "They're sending a message," Vale said, her arms crossed as she studied the display. "They want us to know what's coming." Darrow stood at the edge of the display, his gaze fixed on the shifting icons. "And they think we'll stand and watch," he said quietly. "That's their first mistake." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling like a physical presence. When he finally looked up, his expression was hard, unyielding. "Prep the strike teams," he ordered. "We'll meet them on our terms." The Pathfinder moved into position with surgical precision, its course a delicate thread woven through the edges of Velthan territory. The stars outside the viewport burned cold and distant, their light fractured by the faint haze of disrupted energy fields. Inside the ship, the strike teams prepared for deployment. Weapons were calibrated, armor adjusted, every movement measured and purposeful. The air carried a faint tang of ionized metal, mingling with the muted hiss of oxygen recyclers. Vale stood at the head of her team, her voice low but firm as she briefed them. "This isn't about numbers. It's about precision. They expect brute force. We'll give them finesse." Hale worked alongside her, his hands deft as he double-checked equipment. "They've underestimated us once. Let's make sure they regret doing it again." When the first Zelvar ships entered the system, they were met not with an overwhelming force but with calculated chaos. The Pathfinder unleashed a barrage of decoy signals, scattering the Zelvar's formations. Strike teams deployed in precision drops, infiltrating key vessels and targeting their command systems. The Zelvar response was swift and brutal. Plasma fire illuminated the void, casting flickering shadows across the chaos. But the humans moved like shadows themselves, their tactics unpredictable, their strikes devastating. They exploited every weakness, every hesitation, dismantling the Zelvar fleet piece by piece. Inside the Zelvar flagship, the air was thick with tension as Kraskis roared orders, his claws slamming against the command console. "Find them! Destroy them!" But for every human strike team neutralized, another appeared, their precision strikes fracturing the Zelvar's cohesion. The fleet's once perfect formation dissolved into fragmented chaos, their overwhelming firepower rendered impotent against an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. On the Pathfinder, Darrow watched the battle unfold, his expression unreadable. Every movement, every decision was deliberate, calculated, his mind working several steps ahead. "They're falling apart," Vale reported, her voice steady despite the urgency. "Their command structure can't keep up." Darrow's gaze shifted to the display where the Zelvar flagship loomed like a wounded beast. "Finish it," he said quietly. The final strike was a masterstroke of precision. The Zelvar flagship erupted in a cascade of silent light, its destruction rippling through the remaining fleet like a shockwave. The surviving Zelvar ships scattered, their retreat chaotic, desperate. As the battlefield fell silent, the Pathfinder remained motionless, its presence a quiet declaration of victory. Inside the command room, the crew exhaled as one, the tension dissipating like a held breath finally released. Vale turned to Darrow, her expression a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "What's next?" Darrow's gaze lingered on the display, the scattered remnants of the Zelvar fleet fading into the distance. "They'll be back," he said, his voice low. "And so will we." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words a reminder that the war was far from over. The battlefield drifted into uneasy quiet. Wreckage from the Zelvar fleet floated in the void, twisted fragments of bioceramic hulls tumbling end over end like discarded shells. Fires still clung to the debris, their glow subdued in the vacuum. The vast emptiness beyond was deceptively tranquil, but the tension aboard the Pathfinder was anything but. In the command room, a low, rhythmic beep punctuated the silence as the tactical display flickered with updated scans. Commander Elias Darrow stood at the central console, his expression unreadable, a statue in the midst of quiet chaos. His crew moved around him with hushed precision, each task executed with the confidence of repetition. Despite the victory, the air carried an unspoken weight, heavier than any casualty report. "They'll regroup," Lieutenant Vale said, her voice breaking the quiet. She stood beside Darrow, her face illuminated by the cold light of the holographic map. "The Zelvar don't retreat without planning their next strike." Darrow didn't respond immediately. His focus was on the lingering fragments of the enemy fleet, displayed in faint, pulsing red. His gaze held the intensity of a man calculating the moves of an unseen opponent. "They retreated faster than expected," he said finally, his voice low but cutting. "This wasn't panic. It was strategy." Vale's brow furrowed, her sharp features tightening. "A trap?" "Not yet," Darrow replied, his tone sharpening. "This was a message. They want us to believe we've won." From his station, Lieutenant Marcus Hale leaned forward, his fingers hovering over the console. "Then why leave the wreckage? Why not scuttle their ships?" "They want us to see the cost," Darrow said. His voice carried the weight of understanding. "They're not hiding. They're daring us to follow." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Hale exchanged a glance with Vale, his jaw tightening. "So what's the play?" Before Darrow could answer, the comms console emitted a sharp, staccato chime. Vale moved swiftly, her fingers dancing over the controls. The transmission that followed filled the air with a deep, resonant voice that carried the unmistakable edge of authority. "This is High Warlord Kraskis of the Zelvar Dominion. To the Terrans aboard the Pathfinder. You have overstepped your bounds. Your defiance will not be tolerated." The room tensed, every eye fixed on the console. Kraskis's voice continued, each word laced with cold fury. "You consider yourselves predators, but you are prey, cornered and unaware. We have seen your tactics, your arrogance. You fight like scavengers, effective but unworthy of true dominion." The transmission cut off as abruptly as it began, leaving a vacuum of sound in its wake. Vale turned to Darrow, her expression sharp. "He's baiting us." "Let him," Darrow said, his voice quiet but firm. He turned toward the crew, his presence commanding. "Prepare for long-range scans. If they're setting a trap, I want to know where it's being laid." The crew sprang into action, their movements fluid and precise. Darrow returned his attention to the holographic map, his mind working through possibilities. The Zelvar's retreat wasn't an act of cowardice. It was an invitation. Hours later, the Pathfinder drifted at the edge of a dense asteroid belt. The ship's hull thrummed faintly with the strain of its stealth systems, its sensors working overtime to scan the debris-strewn expanse. The belt was a graveyard of celestial bodies, ancient and unwelcoming, its shadows deep and deceptive. "We've got movement," Hale reported, his tone clipped. 3, no, 5 vessels on the far side of the belt. They're holding position." "Zelvar?" Vale asked, stepping closer. "Most likely," Hale replied. "They're not broadcasting signatures, but the formations match their standard protocols." Darrow studied the display, his gaze narrowing. The Zelvar ships were clustered near a large asteroid, their positions carefully calculated to use the surrounding debris for cover. It was a classic ambush formation, designed to lure prey into a confined space. "They're waiting for us to engage," Darrow said, He stepped back from the console, his mind already moving to the next step. They think we'll take the bait. Vale's eyes flicked to him, sharp with understanding. We won't. No, Darrow said, his tone firm. We'll spring the trap. The crew moved with purpose, every action measured and deliberate. The Pathfinder shifted its position, angling itself toward the asteroid belt. Darrow's strategy was unconventional, a calculated risk designed to exploit the Zelvar's arrogance. Deploy decoys, he ordered. Give them something to chase. Hale's hands flew over the console, launching a series of holographic projections into the belt. The decoys shimmered faintly as they moved, mimicking the energy signatures of a Terran fleet. The Zelvar ships took the bait, breaking formation to pursue the false targets. Now, Darrow said, his voice sharp. Engage! The Pathfinder surged forward, its weapon systems lighting up the void. The first Zelvar ship never saw the attack coming. Its shields collapsed in a cascade of energy, its hull fracturing under the assault. The second ship managed a partial evasive maneuver, but it too fell, its bioceramic armor splitting like brittle glass. Inside the Zelvar flagship, Kraskis roared with frustration. Where are they? He demanded, his claws slamming against the console. Find their ship. The Pathfinder was a shadow in the chaos, its movements unpredictable. It darted through the asteroid belt with practiced ease, its strikes precise and devastating. The Zelvar's superior numbers meant nothing against an enemy they couldn't pin down. As the battle raged, Darrow's voice cut through the noise, calm but commanding. Target their engines. We're not here to destroy them. We're here to send a message. The crew obeyed without question, their attacks crippling but measured. Zelvar ships sputtered to a halt, their propulsion systems reduced to smoldering ruins. The Pathfinder moved among them like a ghost, its presence felt but never seen. When the last Zelvar ship was immobilized, Darrow ordered a retreat. The Pathfinder slipped back into the void, its stealth systems rendering it invisible. Behind them, the Zelvar fleet drifted, broken but not destroyed. Back aboard the Pathfinder, the command room was quiet, the adrenaline of battle giving way to reflection. Vale leaned against the console, her expression thoughtful. They'll come back stronger, she said. They won't underestimate us again. They'll try, Darrow replied. He turned to face his crew, his gaze steady. But they're not the only ones learning. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. The Zelvar had issued a declaration of war, but humanity's response had been clear. They would not be prey. The command room of the Pathfinder was steeped in a tension so taut it felt like the air itself might snap. Monitors displayed shifting grids of data, Zelvar ship movements plotted like veins of blood across the galaxy. Commander Darrow stood at the central console, his expression carved from stone as he studied the glowing projections. Lieutenant Vale paced slowly behind him, her boots striking the reinforced floor with a steady rhythm. The metallic tang of recycled air clung to the room, a constant reminder of their isolation in the void. Nearby, Hale leaned over a tactical station, his fingers flicking across the controls to refine projections. They're regrouping faster than we anticipated, Vale said, breaking the silence. Her voice was measured but laced with concern. If Kraskis has a reserve fleet, he's not holding back. They've learned from their losses, Hale added, glancing up. Their formations are tighter, more layered. It'll be harder to fracture their defenses. Darrow didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on a cluster of red markers on the map, his mind running through possibilities with the precision of a machine. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of calculation. They're consolidating near Harkon's reach, he said. A choke point. If we let them hold it, they'll control access to 6 systems. Vale frowned, leaning over the console to inspect the hologram. Harkon's reach? It's an asteroid field, difficult to navigate. They could fortify it easily. Exactly, Darrow said. That's why we can't let them. The statement hung in the air like a drawn blade. Vale exchanged a glance with Hale, both waiting for the inevitable command. Instead, Darrow turned away from the console and moved to the viewport, his silhouette stark against the backdrop of stars. We can't brute force this, he said, his voice low but firm. They expect us to meet them head-on. They've designed their defense for it. We need to outthink them. Vale folded her arms, her expression sharpening. What are you proposing? Diversion, Darrow said, turning back to face them. His gaze was steady, piercing. We draw their attention to the perimeter while slipping a strike team past their defenses, hit their command structure, take out their leadership. Without Kraskis, their cohesion will collapse. Hale frowned, his brow furrowing. It's risky. If they catch the strike team, we're handing them leverage. Risk is the only way to win, Darrow replied. But we don't go in blind. We need intel, real-time updates on their fleet movements, weak points in their formations. If we're going to slip past them, we need to know exactly where to thread the needle. Vale stepped forward, her posture taut with purpose. We have recon drones. They're fast, hard to detect. I can deploy them to map out their formations. It's a start, Darrow said, but it won't be enough. We need leverage. Hale straightened, a flicker of realization crossing his face. The Velthan, he said. They've been tracking Zelvar movements for decades. They might have data we can use. Good, Darrow said. Reach out to them. If they're willing to share intel, coordinate with their analysts. In the meantime, we prep the strike team. The crew moved with purpose, the air in the command room charged with anticipation. Hale worked at the communications console, his fingers moving in quick, precise patterns as he established contact with the Velthan. Vale disappeared into the lower decks, rallying the strike team and overseeing equipment checks. Darrow remained at the central console, his focus unwavering. The Velthan response came swiftly, their transmission a series of layered tones that Hale translated into readable data. The holographic display updated with new information, intricate details of Zelvar fleet compositions and vulnerabilities filling the screen. They've got overlapping fields of fire, Hale reported, his tone brisk. But the drones found a gap near Sector 7. It's narrow, barely wide enough for a small craft, but it's there. Darrow studied the map, his mind assembling the pieces of the plan. That's our entry point, he said. We send the strike team through the gap, using the asteroid field for cover. Once they're inside, their priority is disabling the flagship's command systems. And the rest of the fleet? Hale asked. We keep them occupied, Darrow said, his voice hardened. Deploy decoy signals along the perimeter. Make them think we're staging a full-scale assault. When they commit to defending the perimeter, we move. The strike team assembled in the hangar bay, their armor gleaming under the harsh lights. Vale inspected their gear with practiced efficiency, her movements sharp and deliberate. Each member of the team carried a distinct energy, some tense, others calm, but all resolute. This isn't about glory, Vale said, her voice carrying across the hangar. This is about precision. Stick to your roles, follow the plan, and we'll get out alive. The strike craft launched with a hiss of pressurized seals, its hull barely larger than a cargo pod. It slipped into the void with practiced ease, its trajectory plotted to thread the narrow gap in the Zelvar defenses. Inside, the team moved with quiet focus, their breath steady, their eyes sharp. Back aboard the Pathfinder, Darrow watched the tactical display with unwavering focus. The decoy signals were working. Zelvar ships had moved to intercept the Phantom fleet, their formations spreading thin, but the window was narrow. Any delay, and the strike team would be exposed. They're through the perimeter, Hale reported, his voice taut. Approaching the flagship now. Inside the Zelvar flagship, the atmosphere was thick with controlled chaos. Officers moved briskly, their segmented forms glinting under the harsh lights. Kraskis stood at the center of the command deck, his multifaceted eyes scanning the readouts. They're testing us, he growled. Deploy reserves to the perimeter. I want no surprises. But the strike team was already inside. They moved like shadows through the narrow corridors, their movements precise and synchronized. Each step was calculated, each breath measured. The air was cold, carrying a faint metallic tang that stung their senses. Vale led the way, her rifle held steady, her eyes scanning every shadow. Keep it quiet, she whispered, her voice barely audible. No mistakes. The team reached the command core, a massive chamber filled with pulsating energy conduits. The air vibrated faintly, the power of the ship's systems coursing through the walls. Vale gestured for the team to fan out, their movements silent and fluid. "Plant the charges," she ordered. "We don't need to destroy it, just disable it." As the team worked, the faint sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors. Vale froze, her hands signaling for silence. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the metallic click of claws on steel. "They know we're here," one of the operatives murmured. "Hold position," Vale said, her voice calm but firm. "Let them come to us." The Zelvar guards appeared in the doorway, their weapons raised. But before they could fire, the team moved, their attacks precise and devastating. The firefight was brief, the Zelvar falling in a matter of seconds. "Charges set," one of the operatives reported. "Fall back," Vale ordered. "We're done here." The team retreated through the corridors, their movements swift but controlled. Behind them, the charges detonated, a ripple of energy surging through the ship's systems. Lights flickered, alarms blared, and the once imposing flagship was reduced to disarray. Back aboard the Pathfinder, Darrow watched as the Zelvar fleet faltered, their formation collapsing. He allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. "Message delivered," he said quietly. The Zelvar fleet hung in the void like wounded beasts, their once impenetrable formations scattered into disarray. Fragments of their flagship's command systems floated aimlessly, dimming in the faint light of a distant sun. The Pathfinder maintained its position at the edge of the battle zone, a sentinel in the darkness. In the command room, Commander Darrow stood at the center of the glowing tactical display. The red markers representing enemy ships flickered erratically as the remnants of the Zelvar forces attempted to regroup. The silence was thick, not with relief, but with the sharp edge of anticipation. This wasn't over. "They're scrambling for structure," Lieutenant Vale said, breaking the stillness. Her voice was calm but underpinned with a sharp readiness. "Kraskis is still alive. He'll try to rally what's left." "He won't get the chance," Darrow replied. His gaze was unflinching, fixed on the flickering red icon of the Zelvar flagship. "Send the message. Let them know they're finished." Vale nodded and turned to Hale, who activated the communications relay. The air in the room grew heavier as Darrow's voice carried through the channels, steady and cold, yet laced with a gravity that seemed to resonate beyond the words themselves. "High Warlord Kraskis, this is Commander Elias Darrow of the Terran vessel Pathfinder. Your flagship is crippled, your fleet scattered. You can order your forces to stand down, or we will finish what you started." The channel hissed with static before Kraskis's guttural voice cut through. "You think you've won?" he snarled. "This is nothing. You're an infestation. We will purge your kind from the galaxy." Darrow's expression didn't waver, his tone a blade slicing through the warlord's bluster. "You speak of purging, yet you stand defeated. Your arrogance has cost you. Your soldiers know it. Your allies know it. Surrender, Kraskis. You have no more moves to play." The warlord's voice returned, quieter but seething with venom. "You don't understand what you've done. The Council will turn against you. The galaxy will see you for what you are. Monsters." Darrow let the words hang in the air, unshaken. When he finally responded, his voice was calm, but it carried the weight of something unrelenting. "Let them see. We didn't come here to be liked." The channel cut abruptly. In the silence that followed, Vale stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Do you think he'll stand down?" "No," Darrow said simply, "but his fleet will." Outside, the Zelvar ships began to drift further apart, their weapon systems powering down. Kraskis's command carried no weight among soldiers who now understood the cost of his hubris. One by one, the ships disengaged, retreating into the shadow of the asteroid belt. Their retreat wasn't orderly, it was survival. Vale watched the tactical display, her sharp features illuminated by its faint glow. "They're running. They're thinking," Darrow corrected. "Fear makes people smarter." Hale leaned forward, his voice cautious. "What happens when they regroup? When they come back stronger?" "They won't," Darrow said, his gaze shifting to the central console. "This was never just about the Zelvar." Vale's brow furrowed. "The Council. Darrow nodded, his expression hardening. This is the message they needed. The Zelvar are proof that the Council's methods don't work. They watch, they debate, but they don't act. That's the real threat to the galaxy. The room fell quiet again, the weight of his words settling over the crew. Beyond the viewport, the remnants of the battlefield stretched endlessly, a testament to both destruction and resolve. Hale broke the silence, his voice tinged with curiosity. Do you think they'll listen? They don't have a choice, Darrow said, his tone final. We've shown them what happens when they hesitate. They can fear us, hate us, but they'll know we don't wait for permission to do what's necessary. Vale's expression shifted, a mix of admiration and unease. That's a dangerous line to walk. Darrow met her gaze, his voice low but unyielding. It's the only line that matters. The silence stretched, heavy and reflective. Outside, the first flashes of retreating Zelvar ships vanished into the distance, leaving the Pathfinder alone in the expanse. Darrow turned back to the crew, his tone sharpening with purpose. Prepare a report for the Council, he said. Let them know what happened here. Detail every decision, every strike. They'll scrutinize us. Let them. The truth is on our side. Vale and Hale exchanged a glance, then nodded. The crew moved with renewed focus, their steps purposeful as they carried out the orders. Darrow remained at the console, his gaze distant but sharp, as if seeing beyond the edges of the map. Hours later, the Pathfinder docked at the Galactic Council station. The ship's stark utilitarian design stood in sharp contrast to the sleek and ornate vessels surrounding it. As the crew disembarked, their boots struck the polished floors with a steady rhythm, their black uniforms a statement of unyielding resolve. Inside the council chamber, the atmosphere was electric. Delegates filled the tiers, their expressions a mix of outrage, apprehension, and reluctant respect. The Silthar mediator stood at the center, their energy form flickering with barely restrained tension. Darrow stepped onto the dais, his posture commanding but calm. His voice carried through the chamber with a deliberate precision. The Zelvar Dominion has been defeated. Their fleet is in disarray. Their warlord is powerless. The Council's inaction nearly cost an entire sector its survival. We didn't intervene to gain favor or approval. We acted because it was necessary. The Zion ambassador's crystalline form refracted the light into sharp patterns as they spoke, their tone cutting. Your actions were reckless. You undermine the Council's authority. Darrow turned to them, his gaze piercing. Authority without action is irrelevant. The galaxy doesn't need your debates. It needs solutions. The chamber erupted into murmurs, voices clashing in disagreement and uncertainty. Darrow waited, letting the weight of his words settle. When the noise subsided, he spoke again, his tone low but resonant. Humanity didn't come here to conquer or to dominate. We came because we saw what you wouldn't. When the galaxy falters, we act. That is who we are. Fear us if you must. Hate us if you will. But you cannot ignore us. The silence that followed was absolute. Darrow turned and walked from the dais, his delegation following close behind. The council chamber buzzed with tension, but no one dared to stop him. They could only watch as the humans left, their presence echoing in the space they had claimed. The Pathfinder lifted off, its shadow stretching long against the light of the stars. Inside, Darrow stood at the viewport, his reflection faint against the infinite void. Vale stepped beside him, her voice quieter now. Do you think they'll change? They'll have to, Darrow said, his voice soft but unyielding. Because we just showed them how.